Thank you so very much, Mr. Sonia Gandhi, for those for that admirable summary of the legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru and for your very kind words to me. Most grateful. I've always, when Penguin decided to republish this book, I knew there was only one person I wanted to re-release it. Um, the 2003 edition was released by the then leader of the opposition in the upper house, Dr. Manmohan Singh. And in 2018, the person who is ideal to do this, Srimati Sonia Gandhi, very graciously consented to do so. Ideal not only because she embodies in many ways her role as the custodian of the legacy of Nehruji and the Nehru family, but also because I have a personal memory. I was working in the UN in those days, and far, far away, the Indian newspapers would make their way to me. The internet was there, of course, but not everything got on the internet in 2003. But I heard from excited friends in India that shortly before the elections of 2004, Mrs. Gandhi had given her first television interview. It was, I think, Walk the Talk with Shekhar Gupta. And Shekhar asked her, so Mrs. Gandhi, what do you like to do in your spare time? And she said, I like to read. So he said, oh, what are you reading now? And she said, Shashi Tharoor's Nehru, the Invention of India. So the result was prompt fame, attention, and success for this volume. So it owes its success to you, Mrs. Gandhi, from the very start. And I'm delighted that you have given it a boost in its second iteration. Dr. Karan Singh ji, thank you so much for your graciousness in joining us. I was telling Mrs. Gandhi, Dr. Karan Singh was a cabinet minister when I was a college student. So I've regarded him with great respect and affection. But I've also had the pleasure of chairing him as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament, of which he was our longest and most senior member until his retirement from Parliament just a few months ago. I don't think it'd be fair to mention everyone here, but some of my former ministerial colleagues, in particular Parliament colleagues, are here. My friend Pallam Raju, my friend Sanjay Singh, my colleague in the All India Professionals Congress, Amita Singh, many others associated with carrying on the torch of Nehruvianism. And of course, I do want to mention and acknowledge the presence of the man who is making a fine web series out of this book, Sheetal Talwar, whose promo you all have just seen. What can I say to you today about the Nehruvian legacy that Mrs. Gandhi hasn't already said? I think that if you look at the legacy he has left us, and you listen, as you must have done, to those words that he himself spoke at that midnight moment of our independence, I think you get a very clear sense of the vision of the man, what he strived to do in his 17 years as Prime Minister. My book, of course, talks about his early career as well, his role from his birth and student days right through his role in the nationalist movement. But today, if we were to look back on the life, what we really need to look at is what he has left us behind. And I would simply add a few details to what Mrs. Gandhi has already spelled out. I think it's important to stress, because it cannot be stressed enough, how much we owe our democracy to Jawaharlal Nehru. You know, in 1947, our country was ravaged by the flames of partition. 1 million people were killed, 13 million people displaced, billions of rupees of property damaged. There was chaos in the land. And it would have been very easy at that time for the leadership of the country to say, democracy is not an option. We need a firm hand to be able to knit together these 565 princely states, these warring factions, these communities ripped apart by such horrendous communal violence. Nehruji was never even tempted by such a prospect. During his first moment of mass public adulation, which is the election campaign of 1936-37, when we had it wasn't a full-fledged election because not everyone had the vote. The British had various restrictions in terms of property rights, literacy, and so on. And so, in fact, I think barely 1 out of 50 Indians actually had the vote, but still it was a mass electorate. And Nehruji was a star campaigner for the Congress, traveling up and down the length and breadth of the country. And it was noticed that he was soaking up the adulation of the masses. Wherever he went, throngs would come, particularly large numbers of women, it was pointed out. And there was this tremendous admiration for this charismatic, youthful, vigorous figure. You may have noticed in the promo, Nehruji running up the steps to the podium for his Independence Day address. He didn't walk up, he ran up. He was full of this boundless energy and enthusiasm. And shortly thereafter, a few months thereafter, there appeared in the Modern Review of Calcutta, which was the preeminent intellectual magazine of the era, an article, anonymous, not attributed to anyone, attacking Nehru, saying this man could be dangerous. He enjoys mass adulation far too much. We want no Caesars. A man like him must be checked. Of course, the article created a bit of a buzz. People were curious as to who would have written this attack on Nehru, what it was all about. And in due course, in the fullness of time, not immediately, it emerged that the author of this anonymous attack on Jawaharlal Nehru was none other than Jawaharlal Nehru himself. And the reason was very clear. He wanted to issue this public warning both to himself and to the people of India. Don't let your head be swayed. The country matters more than the individual. The institutions and structures matter more than the fame, the glory, the transient glamour that election victories will bring you. And he carried this spirit through in his 17 years as Prime Minister. It's fascinating reading, obviously, his own thoughts and his own correspondence and speeches, but also fascinating watching him in action in those grainy black and white newsreel footage. For example, the almost excessive deference that he showed to the president and the vice president of the country, who outranked him in protocol terms. Why would he do that? Very simple. In 1948, Gandhiji died. In December 1950, Sardar Patel died. There was simply no one of comparable stature left in the Indian political firmament. The man was essentially unchallengeable. All the more reason he felt to show that he was no supremo. By showing in public on those newsreel films this kind of very gracious deference to the people who outranked him in protocol terms, but clearly mattered much less than him in political terms, he was again conveying, respect the institution. Respect the institution. That was always the message. And that respect for the institution is what built our democracy. It was not just the respect for the presidency and the vice presidency. It was respect for Parliament. Nehruji attended every single day of Parliament, a very striking contrast to what we have seen from our current Prime Minister, who I gather has probably made more speeches in foreign parliaments and assemblies in the last 4.5 years than in his own, of which he is a member. Nehruji not only attended, he obliged his cabinet to be there, and he obliged senior officials to be there. He gave the opposition an importance out of all proportion to their own intrinsic numbers. They were very, very modest. The first couple of elections were gigantic sweeps for the Congress party. The opposition was insignificant. It could have been disregarded. He never disregarded it. He made sure that the opposition felt free to criticize him and that he took their criticism seriously and responded as much as part of a process of public education, as much as a part of feeling that you are there, you have won votes and come to this house, I owe you an explanation. It was quite remarkable that he also encouraged his own party members to speak out against him. There are many, many memorable moments of this, nothing more famous perhaps than Firoz Gandhi taking him on issue after issue, and in particular when the then finance minister was embroiled in a certain scandal involving the Life Insurance Corporation, the Mundra scandal, and the opposition by a Congress party backbencher led to the resignation of his own party's finance minister. That was the kind of political culture Nehruji was trying to install. And he took it very well. I mean, many of you know the famous story when, in the lead up to the 62 war, he made that perhaps ill-advised remark talking about Aksai Chin, that not a blade of grass grows there. Whereupon it was a Congress party MP, Mahadev Mishra, who stood up in Parliament. Mahadev Tyagi, who stood up and said, I beg your pardon, that's a more contemporary political figure, who stood up and said, pointing to his bald head, "Not a hair grows here. Are you going to give this to the Chinese too?" And Nehruji laughed and took in good spirit and conceded his point. This was the kind of spirit you see, and you see it across the board, issue after issue. You see it very much in the respect for the free press that Mrs. Gandhi mentioned. He was frequently lampooned by cartoonists, and the leading cartoonist of the day, Shankar of Shankar's Weekly, Nehruji famously would call and ask for copies of some of the most savage cartoons about him that he could then hang up in his own house. At one occasion, he met Shankar at a reception and said, in the hearing of others, "Don't spare me, Shankar." And the other thing about him was that he made it a point to give Shankar successively the Padma Shri, the Padma Bhushan, and the Padma Vibhushan. And this was a man who therefore wanted to see constructive criticism of his work, and even particularly humorous criticism of his work. And then the judiciary. You know, this institution building had to be across the board. Parliament, the free press, the structures of the system. But the judiciary was very important. I mean, Mr. Nehru was occasionally a hot-tempered man. He would lose his temper. And in a press conference, he said something intemperate about a judge, a particular judgment the Congress party didn't like. Barely was the press conference over, then he regretted what he had done. He immediately dashed off a letter of apology to the judge in question. And then he wrote what can only be described as a groveling letter to the Chief Justice of India, apologizing for having insulted the judiciary. And he made those letters public. What is the purpose of doing this? Again, the same message. The institutions matter, not the individual. There's this unfair, ridiculous charge by some in the present ruling dispensation that he tried to groom his daughter as a successor. On the contrary, at no stage did he indicate a preference for any successor. And what is more, when she was a very highly effective president of the Congress party, as with other presidents at that time, he gave her the 1 year and that was it. She was replaced and that was it. It was her turn, she was on. He was very clear about all of these things. And I think when you look back on the extraordinary contribution he made to building up the kind of respect for democracy that we have now taken for granted, I think one of the absolute evidences for his success was that upon his death, when American journalist Wallace Hangen had even published a book saying, "After Nehru, who?" and the diplomatic corps was busy asking, "After Nehru, what?" When Nehruji died, the nation wept, but there were no political or constitutional convulsions. An acting prime minister was appointed. A Congress party then elected a new prime minister. The nation went on, and that's exactly what Nehruji would have wanted, because he was asked by an American editor, Norman Cousins, of the Saturday Evening Post, "What do you want to be your legacy to India?" And he said, 330 million people capable of governing themselves. That was an extraordinary line, which I found in this magazine and have used in the book, because although the numbers have grown, that really was, I think, his most significant legacy. Our democracy exists because of Jawaharlal Nehru shaping it, making it possible. During those 17 years, a number of post-colonial heroes in other ex-colonies had gone the opposite way. From Nkrumah to Kaunda to Nyerere, they started off as democratically popular heroes and headed in an authoritarian direction, saying that you needed authoritarianism in order to keep the country under control, to keep it together, to prevent divisions, and to direct development. Nehruji never fell into that trap. So if today we have a Chaiwala as Prime Minister, it's because Nehruji made it possible to create the institutional structures through which any Indian can aspire to and rise to the highest office in the land. I'll be a little briefer on the other elements Mrs. Gandhi pointed out. Secularism is probably self-evident. This was a man without a prejudiced bone in his body. And it was quite remarkable that it's partly from his very upbringing. He had a Muslim munshi in the house whom he looked to with great deference and respect. His closest friends included, in fact, perhaps for some years, his absolutely closest friend, the man with whom he exchanged some remarkable letters and some very intimate, revealing personal letters, Syed Mahmud, was a Muslim. In fact, in one of those letters, he says he doesn't like his name. He says, Jawahar is bad enough, but the addition of Lal makes it odious. So, and this is something he confided into with his friend Syed Mahmud, and he was also not particularly religious. I think we have to accept the fact that the well springs of Nehruvian secularism did lie in agnosticism. It was not that he disrespected religion, but that he had no time for the professed leaders of it. He has letters, one of which I've quoted in the book, where he says, I have no patience for mullahs and maulvis and sadhus and sants. They don't have all the answers to the problems of the nation. And that is an interesting thing, because while that was very much his personal proclivity, he never imposed that on a nation which was obviously very deeply steeped in religion. And it's interesting, for example, the disagreement he had with President Rajendra Prasad about the president's wish to inaugurate the rebuilt Somnath temple. He said, the temple may be built, but you are the president of the country. As a symbol of the Indian state, you should not be the one going there. President Prasad insisted. He went, and Nehruji bit his tongue. But the fact still is, it was more the idea that the state must be above communal biases, and what is more, that the state must keep a distance from activities identified with any one religious community. Now, we know the country has evolved differently from his time, but he chose to maintain an attitude of equal respect for and equal distance from all religions throughout his time in office. And one of the things that was striking about his 17 years is, of course, no one has ever seen him entering a religious place of worship of any denomination. But at the same time, no one has ever heard him say one disrespectful word or one negative comment about what he accepted were other people's precious beliefs. But what was very important was, again, context. What was the India of 1947? Torn apart by the desire of one particular community or its politically elected leaders for a different nation. Again, the temptation to say, all right, if Pakistan has been created as a country for Muslims, what remains is a country for Hindus? He never fell into that temptation. He never accepted the logic of partition, and the logic of partition having been rejected, that if you want to believe that religion is a determinant of nationhood, that is the idea of Pakistan. If you don't believe that religion is a determinant of nationhood, but that your nationalism embraces all, that is the idea of India. And it's on that spirit that Nehruji moved forward. And as you know, from what he has been able to build up, I remember all those slogans in my school days of national integration, both the symbolism and the substance of secularism in government policy, in government appointments, and the fact that there were powerful cabinet ministers, officials, army and air force and navy officers, ambassadors from every community. And indeed, the same for our diplomats, for our cricket captains. Nehruji always weighed in favor of the diversity of India. And that secularism as a recognition of diversity and pluralism was again a vital Nehruvian legacy. Socialism, Mrs. Gandhi has already put it very well, and you heard it in his speech. It came from an urgent and abiding concern for India's poor. He was always very much concerned about those who weren't born into the kinds of opportunities he'd had. He was the son of the wealthiest lawyer in Allahabad. Motilal Nehru was the first person in Allahabad, brown or white, to bring a motor car into the city, because he was the first one who could afford to do so. Nehruji knew he'd grown up in the lap of privilege and was therefore all the more conscious of the needs to address the absolute desperation of those who had so little. And right through his political career, you see this from his early 20s onwards. In fact, even in the UK as a student, there's a wonderful anecdote when he went, I think, once to a dance, a social dance, and he chose to dance with a waitress because he wanted to find out what the lower classes would talk about. He wasn't interested in one of the glamorous society ladies. This kind of curiosity and concern for the underprivileged, for those at the bottom of society, marked his socialism. And of course, that was the temper of the times. He was strongly influenced by many of the Fabian socialist thinkers in the UK, notably Harold Lasky, who became a friend. He was also, of course, somebody who had visited the Soviet Union in the 1920s with his father, and was quite impressed by what he saw. And he saw in many ways, as many intellectuals of that period did, an answer to the problems of poverty and of underdevelopment in the socialist way. And don't forget, it's also a reaction to imperialism. Colonial exploitation and loot of India was being done by those who had ostensibly come to do good but preferred to do well. And these people were essentially draining India's resources for the benefit of their mother country. And naturally, part of the rejection of imperialism involved a rejection of international capital and, by extension, to some degree, of Indian capitalism. As Mrs. Gandhi said, that's evolved a lot. The Congress Party itself was in the forefront of the liberalization of 1991. But what has never left the party, and that's again is an essential component of the Nehruvian legacy, is the respect for social justice. Because socialism, once you take about the ism, and Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi famously said, "I don't believe in isms, I believe in people." The truth is that isms apart, what remains is this abiding concern for social justice. And Mrs. Gandhi mentioned briefly, and I think the introduction mentioned the many policies followed by the Congress Party as part of UPA 1 and 2, which have tried to deepen the social justice legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru in our contemporary politics. Finally, on foreign policy and non-alignment, I'd say very simply that non-alignment was a response to a particular period, the binary politics of the Cold War, but at the same time, it was something that allowed India to stand with self-respect on the world stage. There's an apocryphal story that I think I do quote in the book about John Foster Dulles, President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who had famously or notoriously said that non-alignment, neutrality between good and evil is itself evil, he said. And the story goes that he asked Nehruji in a question that has become more familiar to us on the lips of a more recent American figure. He allegedly said, "Are you with us or against us?" And Nehruji smiled and replied, "Yes." So we are with you when we agree with you, we are against you when we disagree. And that, I think, sums it up. It has been called by scholars an emphasis on strategic autonomy. But strategic autonomy basically means for 200 years, a foreign country has been taking decisions for us. We will now take our own decisions. It may sometimes be in your favor, it may sometimes be against you, but we will decide. You won't decide for us. And in a world of alliances being created, NATO, CETO, CENTO, all of that, India was invited to join CETO. And India declined, saying that we don't see the need for these things. We would rather, not having won our freedom and our autonomy, we'd rather not mortgage it right now to another alliance. We'll make our own decisions. And I think that must be understood. He was also, of course, in many ways, the originator of Indian foreign policy, going right back to the nationalist movement, when he was Gandhiji's preferred delegate to a number of international conferences, international socialist conferences, anti-colonial conferences. He was always the articulator of India's place in the world and the drafter of Indian National Congress's resolutions on foreign policy. And so when he came to office, it was natural that he would continue expressing this independent voice. Today, you could argue we don't have two superpowers to be non-aligned between. But I think what you cannot argue against is that fundamental idea that our autonomy, our strategic decision-making is about our self-respect. It is about not allowing anyone else to dictate to us what we can or should not do or say, and we will decide. We may choose not to say something, we may choose to say something. We may choose to do something, we may choose not to do it. But it'll be because we, sovereign, independent Indians, have made that decision. Now, that is the legacy in many ways. So we've seen, sadly, a concerted campaign of vilification, a concerted campaign of calumny, an astonishing amount of lies that are out there on the internet, All of you, I'm sure, if you are on WhatsApp, will have received God knows how many offensive messages. And why is there this desire to undermine such a great son of India, somebody who laid the foundations for what we have created? You don't like socialism, fine, but you're not going to disavow the institutions that he created, as we said in the promo. That entire underpinning of India's scientific establishment. If today the government can boast about Mangalyaan, ask who created ISRO, who decided that even poor India could dare to aim for the skies, who created the IITs that send so many bright young men to Silicon Valley so that 40% of the startups there are helmed by Indians, who became the only prime minister in the world to attend these countries' the National Science Congress every year, and to speak there and to give respect and support to scientists. All of this in a poor country was optional. You had to have the vision to say we need to do all these things. We need to lay the foundations to build the India of the future. You know, in many ways, this is taken for granted by our people. We decry the fact that we still have poverty in our country. We don't realize that when Nehruji came to power in 1947, 90% of the Indian population lived below the poverty line. We talk about the rate of growth under Mr. Nehru with a certain amount of disparagement. But the rate of growth from 1900 to 1947 was below 0.01%. We talk about the fact that we still have malnourishment, hunger, etc. We forget the fact that in 1947, the life expectancy of the average Indian was 27. People born in India could not expect to live beyond 27. Today, it's nearer the biblical 70. We talk about how so many Indians still remained illiterate, but we don't know, or we don't remember that the British left us with 16% literacy, and that of Indian women, it was 8.8%. Of every 12 Indian women, only one was literate. 12 and a half Indian women, actually. So that was the kind of legacy from which he was building up the state. When you realize what India was in 1947, when you realize the poverty, the horror, the loot, the suffering that had been inflicted upon the nation for 200 years, you then begin to understand how much was achieved in these 17 years. That instead of going into a tin pot, third world dictatorship, quote unquote, the cliched phrases of so many Western journalists or so many countries in the developing world, that India became a shining beacon by its own example, a democracy that worked, a society that actually strived to pull up the people at the bottom of the ladder, a country in which the most astonishing diversity was managed together in order to create one people and one nation, a country which stood proud and independent and spoke its own voice in the world, so that as late as the first decade of the 21st century, an Egyptian ambassador to the UN, who later went on to become his country's foreign minister, was able to say to me, you know, when I don't know about an issue that's unexpectedly come up, I send my diplomats to the Indians to find out what they're saying, because if they're saying it, it'll be all right, my country can say it too. That is the respect that India enjoys because of the foundation, the pillars that Nehruji laid for us. Let us today remember that man. I want to thank Penguin and my good friend Ranjana Sengupta for having brought a handsome new edition of this book before all of you. I must say that it's a vast improvement on the original. So even those of you who have, I don't mean in terms of the content is the same, despite a new introduction that I have written. But the presentation, the printing, the layout is much more handsome than the original edition that came out in 2003. So even if you have a copy of that one, get one of this. It's really worth it. And I want to thank all of you. And once again, Mrs. Gandhi, in fact, I was just thinking, Dr. Karan Singh, that the last time we talked about Nehruji's letters was when Dr. Karan Singh published a compilation of letters of his and Nehruji's across the years. I believe I had the great pleasure of reading some of these letters aloud to the audience. So it's a matter of great satisfaction today to see Mrs. Gandhi here, Dr. Karan Singh here, and all of you good friends. Thank you again, Penguin. Jai Hind.